Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of our Towards Life 3.0 series. My name is Mathias Risse, and I am the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I welcome you also on behalf of our executive director, Sushma Raman, who will be joining us for the Q&A period at the later stage. Now, as many of you know, our series Towards Life 3.0, Ethics and Technology in the 21st Century, has been around for a few years. The title, the 3.0 part, we take from Max Tegmark's wonderful book, Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And the goal of this series is to explore ethical and human rights related issues that arise in the course of the technological innovation that is happening all around us and might eventually take us to a full-fledged Life 3.0, a phase of life populated by entities that get to design both their culture, their software, so to speak, and their bodies, their hardware. We do not know if that kind of life will ever emerge or when, but we also don't want to start thinking about its ethical dimensions only once it is clear that it will indeed emerge. And in any event, there are plenty of such challenges, ethical and human rights related challenges all around us already today, and as part of the technological innovation that is happening very concretely all around us, that the agenda of this series is indeed ongoing. We are very lucky today to have with us Professor John Tasioulas, who is Professor of Ethics and Philosophy of Law at the University of Oxford, and is also the founding director of a new Institute for Ethics in AI, as well as a senior research fellow at Balliol College in Oxford. And I'm actually quite envious of all the activities that Oxford is doing in this domain. So the Institute for Ethics in AI is thereby joining several other institutes in the AI domain that the University of Oxford already has. Professor Tasioulas has worked broadly at the intersection of law and morality, and among other things has defended a distinctive take on human rights, which of course makes him a person of interest to the Carr Center anyway. And he understands human rights in a rather orthodox manner, and according to which they are moral rights possessed by all humans simply in virtue of their humanity. This contrasts with the more recent view that has characterized human rights in terms of some political roles, such as being triggers for international intervention or benchmarks of international legitimacy. So distinctive view in that domain. My own view on human rights, I might add, is a bit of an intermediate view between those two bookend views. So there's interesting conversations to be had there, but that's not our topic for today. Before founding the Ethics and AI Institute at Oxford, John was also the founding director of the Yeo Tiong Lai Center for Politics, Philosophy and Law at King's College, London. Professor Tasioulas will talk to us today about a question rather central to this series: why we need AI ethics to begin with. One way of thinking about this topic is that in recent decades, the place of the humanities at universities around the world has come ever more under siege. And educational and research priorities in many cases have shifted towards science and engineering, and also increasingly towards computer science. And it is obvious that computer science and computer scientists have become increasingly important to how the future of our societies will be designed. More generally, again, technological innovation is all around us. And it is that fact that has been reflected in that shifting of educational and research priorities. However, the increasing importance of technological innovation ipso facto really brings the humanities right back in, or in any event should bring them right back in, because it is in the humanities that the human choice making gets theorized that inevitably needs to stand behind the technological innovation, right? The questioning of what are we actually doing here and what do we aim to achieve here. In this talk, Professor Tasioulas will offer a humanistic ethics specifically for AI, humanistic, what he calls a humanistic ethics specifically for AI, and will offer then also some thoughts on how the prospects of artificial general intelligence bears on the humanistic outlook as he will develop it. He will talk to us for about 30 minutes. In fact, he will present a paper for about the duration of that time. And after that, we will be turning to the Q&A part when Sushma will also be joining us. You in the audience are very much encouraged to put your questions in the YouTube chat. And we will eagerly keep an eye on that, on what's unfolding there to bring you into this conversation. But now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming John Tasioulas to our screen.
Well, thank you very much, Matthias, and it's a great privilege to be speaking to you there. I have very fond memories of visiting at Harvard 7 years ago. Not such fond memories of the fact that it was the heaviest snowfall in recorded history. But it's great to be engaging with you in this format, with the recognition that through this format, probably there could be a larger audience than is normally the case. So as Matthias said, I'm going to talk about why AI needs ethics, but I'm in a way largely going to talk about that by giving a kind of rough outline of the kind of ethics that I think it particularly needs. So I want to begin by saying that ethics is first and foremost a domain of ordinary human thought, not a specialist academic discipline. And I think that's important to say because often anyone who advocates the course of ethics in this domain is often seen as engaging in special pleading for some particular discipline. Whereas I want to say ethics is a form of ordinary human thought before it is anything else. Ethics presupposes the existence, as Matthias suggested, of human choices that are to be appraised by reference to a distinctive range of values. And the delimitation of this range of values, among other values, such as aesthetic or religious values, is a philosophically controversial matter. But on a fairly straightforward and standard reading, two very general interlocking questions lie at the heart of ethics. One, what is it to live a good or flourishing life? A question of self-interest or self-fulfillment, broadly understood. And second, what is it that we owe to others, notably fellow human beings, but also non-human animals or even inanimate nature? So the first brings us within the territory of individual well-being, the second question into that of morality, especially the obligations we owe to others and the rights that they hold against us. Now, philosophers expound theories of well-being and morality and of the relations between those two. But all of us, in living our lives, constantly make choices that reflect answers to these questions, however inchoate or unconscious they may be. One of the reasons why children are natural philosophers before even hearing any questions about philosophy. Engagement with ethics is inescapable in decision-making about AI, therefore. The choices we make regarding the development and deployment of AI-based technologies are ultimately intelligible only in terms of the fallible pursuit of ethical values, such as the acquisition of knowledge and control, the promotion of health, justice and security, and so on. Moreover, any form of regulation that might be proposed for AI, whether voluntary self-regulation in deciding whether to use a social robot as a caregiver for my mother, or the social and legal norms that should govern the manufacture and use of such robots, all of these forms of regulation ultimately implicate choices that reflect judgments about ethical values and their prioritization. So a clear-eyed appreciation of the pervasive significance of ethics for AI is sometimes obscured, I think, by an odd contraction that the idea of ethics is liable to undergo in this specific domain. So for example, Kate Crawford in her recent book urges us to focus less on ethics and more on power because, quote, AI is invariably designed to amplify and reproduce the forms of power it has been deployed to optimize, end of quote. But you may ask, what would the recommended focus on power entail? For Crawford, it means interrogating the institutional power structures in which AI is embedded by reference to ideas such as equality, justice, and democracy. But the irony is that these three ideas are either themselves core ethical values, equality and justice, or in the case of democracy, are to be explicated and defended in terms of such values. Nonetheless, Crawford's injunction usefully prompts reflection on the various ways the idea of ethics has been unduly diminished in recent discussions about AI, how we've been operating with a kind of impoverished conception of what ethics is. And no doubt this impoverishment is no doubt partly a result of the prominent role of the big tech players in shaping the field of AI ethics so as to limit the threat it poses to their commercial ambitions. Here are the three ways, or at least here are three ways that the diminishment of ethics is typically affected. And I don't think this is exhaustive. One way is by reference to the content of ethics. The content of ethical standards is often interpreted as exclusively a matter of fairness, which is primarily taken to be a relational concern with how some people are treated compared with how other people are treated. For example, facial recognition technology that systematically disadvantages darker-skinned people, or automated resume scanning tools that are biased against women because the respective algorithms were trained on data sets that are demographically unrepresentative or that reflect historically sexist hiring practices. Now, algorithmic unfairness is a vitally important matter, especially when it exacerbates the condition of members of already unjustly disadvantaged groups. But this shouldn't obscure the fact that ethics also encompasses non-relational concerns, such as whether facial recognition technology should be deployed at all in light of privacy rights that everyone has, or whether it is disrespectful to all job applicants to rank their resumes by means of an automated process. A second way ethics is contracted unduly is by reference to its supposed scope of application. Ethics is sometimes construed as narrowly individualistic in focus, i.e., as concerned with guiding each individual's personal conduct rather than on also bearing on the larger institutional and social settings in which their decisions are made and enacted. Now, in reality, however, almost all key ethical values, such as justice and charity, have profound implications for institutions and patterns of social organization. Plato's Republic, after all, sought to understand justice in the individual soul by considering it writ large in the polity as a whole. Now, admittedly, some philosophers treat political justice as radically discontinuous from justice in the soul. The most influential proponent of this discontinuity thesis in recent decades is the Harvard philosopher John Rawls, who contends that pervasive reasonable disagreement on ethical truth disqualifies beliefs about such truths from figuring as premises in political justification. If people can reasonably disagree on a matter, this cannot be a matter for political justification, and he thinks that people do reasonably disagree on the ethical truth. Now, this is a sophisticated controversy, and one of my reasons for sadness not being able to be at Harvard is I know that unlike Oxford, there are many people who adhere to the Rawlsian view of a distinctive public reason discontinuous from ethical truth. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to address this issue adequately here, save to note that this kind of move, the Rawlsian move, away from taking a stand on ethical truth to some sui generis notion of public reason, it always faces the response that the phenomenon of reasonable disagreement and the need for respect that it highlights, which I think is true, one does have to respect people with whom one is in a reasonable disagreement, is itself yet a further topic for ethical appraisal, and hence cannot displace the need to take a stand on ethical truth. So that's just an assertion I'm making, but just to recognize that there is an important strand in contemporary political philosophy, the Rawlsian strand, that strongly wants to dissociate ethical truth from political justification. As an old-fashioned Aristotelian in this respect, I would strongly want to resist that bifurcation. There's a third way in which the notion of ethics is contracted unduly, and that is by reference to certain concerns about means of enforcing ethics. There's a widespread assumption that ethics relates to norms that are not properly enforceable. For example, not enforceable, not legitimately or properly enforceable through legal mechanisms, but instead are backed up primarily by the sanction of one's own individual conscience, or perhaps also by informal public opinion. But the general restriction of ethics to soft forms of regulation in this way is, I think, arbitrary. The very question whether or not to enact a law or other regulatory norm, and if so, how best to implement and enforce it, is one on which ethical values such as justice and personal autonomy have a significant bearing. Indeed, there is a long-standing tradition, one that cuts across ideological boundaries. For example, it unites Kant and utilitarians like Mill, that identifies justice precisely with those moral rights that should in principle receive social and legal enforcement, i.e. justice is seen as precisely that subset of ethical norms that should be enforced legally and socially. So this contrast between power and ethics is obviated by that long-standing tradition that, as I say, cuts across major ideological boundaries. So in short, we should reclaim a broad and foundational understanding of ethics in the AI domain, one that potentially encompasses deliberation about any form of regulation, from personal self-regulation to legal regulation backed by sanctions, and which has potentially radical implications for the reordering of social power. And certainly in directing an institute for ethics in AI, it is precisely in this broad foundational sense that I take the notion of ethics. Now, given its inescapability, ethical thought is hardly absent from the contemporary discussions around AI. However, these discussions often suffer from a tendency either to leave explicit their operative ethical assumptions, or else to rely upon them uncritically, even when they are made explicit. Now, we can go further and identify a dominant, or at least a prominent, approach to ethics, one that is widely congenial to powerful scientific, economic, and governmental actors in this space. Like anyone else, AI scientists are prone to the illusion that the intellectual methods at their disposal have a far greater problem-solving purchase than is actually warranted. This is a phenomenon that Plato diagnosed long ago in relation to the technical experts of his own day, artisans such as cobblers and shipbuilders who felt that their expertise in one domain carried over into an expertise on matters of justice, for example. The mindset of scientists working in AI tends to be data-driven. It places great emphasis on optimization as the core operation of rationality, and it prioritizes formal and quantitative techniques. Now, given this intellectual orientation, it is little wonder that a top AI scientist like Stuart Russell, in his recent book, Human Compatible AI and the Problem of Control, is drawn to a preference-based utilitarianism as his overarching ethical standpoint. Russell's book, I should explain, is concerned with a familiar worry that AI, in the form of artificial general intelligence that surpasses human intellectual capabilities, will eventually spiral out of control, unconstrained by human morality, with disastrous consequences. But what is human morality? Well, Russell appears to take it as axiomatic that the morally right thing to do is whatever will maximize the fulfillment of human preferences. In terms of our two core concerns of ethics that I began with, the fulfillment of human preferences is taken to be what well-being consists in. My life is better the more my preferences are fulfilled. And the fundamental moral injunction is to maximize overall well-being, thus conceived, maximize the fulfillment of preferences generally across all people. So ethics is reduced to an exercise in prediction and in optimization. Which act or policy is likely to lead to the optimal fulfillment of human preferences? But this view of ethics is notoriously open to multiple serious and I believe fatal objections. Its core concern with aggregating preferences threatens to override important rights that erect strong barriers to what can be done to individuals. Why not feed a few Christians to the lions if their preferences to stay alive are outweighed by the preferences of a sufficiently large number of bloodthirsty Roman would-be spectators? And that's even before we observe that many preferences are infected with racist, sexist, or other prejudices, that they may reflect false or incomplete information, or that they may be psychological adaptations to oppressive circumstances. Ethics operates in the critical space of reflection on what our preferences should be, a vital consideration that makes a belated appearance only in the last few pages of Russell's book. It cannot, therefore, take those preferences as ultimate determinants of value. Now, of course, there are moral philosophers who defend versions of preference-based utilitarianism that are modified and patched up to address these difficulties that I've been pointing to. But the idea that preference utilitarianism is a highly contestable moral theory does not really register in Russell's book, which conforms with my suspicion that it approximates to a default position among many leading actors in the AI field. The same broad approach is heavily influential among leading economic and governmental actors. This is perhaps less obvious because the doctrine is standardly modified by positing wealth maximization as the more readily measurable proxy for preference satisfaction. Hence the tendency for GDP to hijack governmental decision-making around economically consequential technologies, with the resultant sidelining of values that are not readily catered to by the market, such as public goods relating to access to justice or healthcare or the preservation of a sustainable environment. Hence also the legitimation of profit maximization by corporations as the most effective institutional means to societal wealth maximization. Now, of course, many who adopt such an approach have never heard of utilitarianism, or if they have, many of them officially reject it. But one revealing indication of the dominance of an ideology is the way that people who officially disavow it can nonetheless remain in its intellectual grip. Now, I believe that a key priority for those working in the field of AI ethics is to elaborate an ethical approach that transcends the limitations and distortions of this dominant ethical paradigm. In my view, such a humanistic ethics, as I'm going to call it, one that encompasses aspects of the human engagement with the ethical that are not adequately captured by the methods of natural science and mainstream economics, but which are the traditional concern of the arts and humanities, would possess at least the following three interrelated features. And these are just three features I'm picking on, and they are very closely interrelated. The first feature is pluralism. This humanistic ethic would emphasize the plurality of values, both in terms of the plural elements of human well-being, elements like achievement, understanding, friendship, play, and so on, and the plural core components of morality, for example, norms of justice, fairness, charity, the common good, etc. This pluralism of values abandons the comforting notion that the key to the ethics of AI will be found in one single master concept, such as trustworthiness or human rights. How could human rights be the comprehensive ethical framework for AI when, for example, AI has serious environmental impact beyond its bearing on anthropocentric concerns? And what of those important values to which we don't have a right, such as mercy or solidarity? Nor can trustworthiness be the master value. Being parasitic on compliance with more basic values, it cannot itself displace those values. Beyond the pluralism of values is the fact of their potential incommensurability in specific cases of decision. We're often confronted with practical problems that implicate an array of values which pull in different directions in a particular case. In such cases, although some rationally eligible decisions will be superior to others, there may be no single decision which is optimal. In choosing an occupation, for example, teaching may be a better option for me than surgery, but we can't assume that there is a single profession that is, all things considered, best for me, rather than a limited array of eligible alternatives that are no worse than each other. This incommensurability calls into question the availability of some optimizing function that determines the single option which is, all things considered, most beneficial or morally correct, the quest for which has animated a lot of utilitarian ethics. Now, it's worth observing that confidence about the deployment of AI to minimize noise, what's been called noise in human judgment, the unwanted variability, for example, in hiring decisions by employers, or the great variability that apparently is manifested in sentencing by judges, that confidence of using AI to try to minimize such noise displayed in the important new work of Daniel Kahneman, Olivier Sibony, and Cass Sunstein, one of your great professors at Harvard, sometimes involves an implicit reductionism about the values at stake that downplays the scope for incommensurability. For example, the authors, Kahneman, Sibony, Sunstein, of this new book entitled Noise, treat bail decisions as fundamentally predictions of the likelihood that the accused will abscond or reoffend. And they sideline considerations such as the gravity of the offense or the impact of detention on the accused's dependents. But such decisions typically address multi-value problems, and there's no guarantee that there is a single best way of reconciling the competing values in each case. This means not only that algorithms, if we're going to use them in this context, will need to be more sophisticated so as to balance multiple salient values in reaching a justifiable decision, but that much of what looks like noise may be acceptable variability of judgments within the range of rationally eligible alternatives. So we may be exaggerating the extent of noise because we think that there's always a single correct answer, as opposed to a bounded range of options which are all rationally eligible. So that's one element, pluralism. The second element I want to emphasize is procedures. Of course, we want AI to achieve valuable social goals, such as improving access to education, justice, and healthcare in an effective and efficient way. The COVID-19 pandemic has cast into sharp relief the question of the outcomes AI is being used to pursue. For example, is it enabling physicians to diagnose and triage patients faster and more effectively, or is it primarily engaged in profit-making activities like vacuuming up people's attention online, activities that have little or no redeeming social value? The second feature of a humanistic approach to ethics emphasizes that what we rightly care about is not just the value of the outcomes that AI applications can be used to deliver, but the procedures through which they do so. If, for example, important practical decisions exhibit the phenomenon of incommensurability, then we may have good reason to ensure that they're assigned to humans rather than to automated processes in order to preserve a valuable form of autonomy for humans as they express and develop their tastes and characters in choosing from divergent but rationally eligible pathways in life. Now, of course, there'll be a further question here of how to balance such autonomy, freedom to choose from a range of options, against demands for consistency or noiselessness, especially in public decision-making. Should we tolerate significant divergence in sentencing across judges, or should the demands for horizontal equity prevail, ensuring that like cases are treated alike? Proponents of the latter view often recommend the use of algorithms to guide or to replace human decision-making. This itself is a difficult question of striking a balance between competing considerations in our legal culture, with no ex-ante guarantee that one solution will emerge as superior overall. But the case for according ultimate decision-making authority to humans can also be made even if we suppose that a single correct answer is always available. Take, for example, the use of AI in cancer diagnosis and compare it with its use in the sentencing of criminals. Intuitively, the two cases seem to exhibit a difference in the comparative valuing of the soundness of the eventual decision or diagnosis and the process through which it is reached. When it comes to cancer, generating the most accurate diagnosis might be all important, it being largely a matter of indifference whether this is generated by the use of an AI diagnostic tool or the exercise of human judgment. In criminal sentencing, however, many share the sense that being sentenced by a robot judge, even if the sentence is likely to be less biased or less noisy than one rendered by a human counterpart, sacrifices important values, such as the ideal of reciprocity among fellow citizens that is central to the rule of law. The last point is familiar, of course, in relation to such process values as transparency, procedural fairness, and explainability. Even if the procedure followed by the judicial algorithm can be made transparent, there is a serious question, given, for example, the vast discrepancy between machine learning and ordinary human reasoning processes, whether it affords an explanation of the right kind, one that a criminal defendant can grasp as offering genuine reasons for the decision to imprison him. But the point goes beyond the important issue of explainability, because of the dread many understandably feel, contemplating the prospect of a world in which judgments that bear on our deepest interests and moral standing have, at least as their proximate decision makers, autonomous machines that do not have a share in human solidarity and cannot be held accountable in the way that human judge can for their decisions. Third feature I want to highlight in the humanistic ethics is participation. This relates also to the process of decision-making with respect to AI, and it's about whether there is participation as an individual or as part of a group of self-governing democratic citizens. At the level of individual well-being, this takes the focus away from theories that equate human well-being with an end state, such as pleasure or preference satisfaction. These end states could in principle be brought about through a process in which the person who enjoys them is passive. For example, if the government pumps an antidepressant drug into the water supply. Contrary to this passive view, it would stress that successful engagement with valuable pursuits is at the core of human well-being. Now, if the conception of human well-being that emerges is deeply participatory, then this bears heavily on the delegation of decision-making power to AI applications. One of the most important sites of participation in constructing a good life in modern societies is the workplace. According to a McKinsey study, around 30% of all work activities in 60% of occupations are capable of being automated. There's also a small number of occupations that can be completely automated. Can we accept the idea that the large-scale elimination of job opportunities can be compensated for by the benefits that automation makes available? Well, the answer partly depends on whether the participatory self-fulfillment available in work can, anytime soon, and for the vast majority of those rendered jobless, be feasibly replaced by other activities such as art, friendship, play, or religion. If it can't, addressing the problem with a mechanism like a universal basic income, which involves the passive receipt of a benefit, will hardly suffice. Instead, much greater attention will need to be paid to how AI can be integrated into productive practices in ways that do not so much replace human work as enhance its quality, making it more productive, fulfilling, and challenging, whilst also less dangerous, repetitive, and lacking in meaning. Similarly, we value citizen participation as part of collective democratic self-government. And arguably, we do so not just because of the instrumental benefits of democratic decision-making in generating superior decisions by harnessing cognitive diversity, but also because of the way in which participatory decision-making processes affirm the status of citizens as free and equal members of the community. This is an essential plank in the defense against the tendency of AI technology to be co-opted by technocratic modes of decision-making that erode democratic values by seeking to convert matters of political judgment into questions of technical expertise. And one of the ways this has happened in the COVID pandemic is under the heading of just following the science, as if science could actually answer value policy questions. Now, at present, much of the culture in AI, in which AI is embedded, is distinctly technocratic, with decisions about the values encoded in AI applications being taken by corporate, bureaucratic, or political elites, often largely shielded from meaningful democratic control. Indeed, a small group of tech giants accounts for the lion's share of investment in AI research, dictating its overall direction and setting the prevalent moral tone. Meanwhile, AI-enabled social media risks eroding the quality of public deliberation that a genuine democracy needs by promoting the spread of disinformation, aggravating political polarization, and so on. Similarly, the use of AI as part of corporate and governmental efforts to monitor and manipulate individuals undermines privacy and threatens the exercise of basic liberties, effectively discouraging citizen participation in democratic politics. Now, as with workplace participation, we need to reflect seriously on how AI and digital technology more generally can enable rather than hinder and distort democratic participation. This is all the more urgent given the declining faith in democracy across the globe in recent years, including in long-established democracies such as the United Kingdom and the US. Indeed, the disillusionment is such that in a recent poll, 51% of Europeans favored replacing at least some of their parliamentarians with artificial intelligent decision makers. There is still time, though, to salvage the democratic ideal that an essential part of citizen dignity is active participation in self-government. An additional complexity here concerns how the two modes of participation in the workplace and in politics are connected. It's obvious that active participation in the two domains is mutually reinforcing in important ways. Thus, powers of reason and sociability that are developed in a participatory workplace and which foster a sense of equal citizen dignity can be brought to bear in democratic deliberation about political questions. Equally, democratic control over the impact of new technologies on the workplace can help preserve and enhance its vital role as a site of genuine human fulfillment. Now, as I reach the concluding section, I want to say I've been mainly focusing on narrow AI, conceived as AI-powered technology that can achieve limited tasks, for example, facial recognition, medical diagnosis, etc., tasks that typically require intelligence when performed by humans. This is partly because serious doubt surrounds the likelihood of artificial general intelligence emerging with any realistically foreseeable timeframe. Partly also because the operative notion of intelligence in discussions of artificial general intelligence is, to me, very problematic. And again, partly also because a focus on artificial general intelligence often distracts us from the more immediate questions of narrow AI. With these caveats in place, however, one can admit that thought experiments about artificial general intelligence can help bring into focus two questions fundamental to any humanistic ethics. What is the ultimate source of human dignity, understood as the inherent value attaching to each and every human being? And how can we relate human dignity to the value inhering in non-human beings? Now, towards the end of Kazuo Ishiguro's novel Clara and the Sun, the eponymous narrator, an artificial friend, speculates that human dignity, the human heart that, quote, makes each of us special and individual, unquote, has its source not in something within us, but in the love that others have for us. But a threat of circularity looms for this bootstrapping humanism. For how can the love of others endow us with value unless those others already themselves have value? Moreover, if the source of human dignity is contingent on the varying attitudes of others, how can it apply equally to each and every human being? Do the unloved lack the human heart? Questions like these explain the tendency among some to interpret the inherent value of each individual human being as arising from the special love that a supremely good, transcendent being, God, represented by the sun in Ishiguro's novel, which the solar-powered Clara treats as a kind of life-sustaining deity, the love that this God has for each human being in equal measure is taken to be the source of human dignity. But invoking a divine being to underwrite human dignity leads us into obvious metaphysical and ethical quagmires, which in turn raises the question, very difficult question, whether the inherent worth of human beings can be explicated within a broadly naturalistic, non-theological framework. Supposing that it can be, this is compatible with a distinct kind of dignity also inhering in other beings, such as non-human animals. Now, we're still struggling to integrate the value of non-human animals within our ethical thought. Doing so requires overcoming the baleful influence of long-standing practices in which animals are treated either as possessing merely instrumental value in relation to our ends, or at best intrinsic value that is conditional on their role in human life. The dream of artificial general intelligence, should it ever become a reality, will generate an even more acute version of this problem, given the prominent role that our rational capacities play in elevating human dignity above the dignity of other beings known to us. For the foreseeable future, however, our focus must be on properly integrating AI technology into a culture that respects and advances the dignity and well-being of humans and the non-human animals with whom we share the world, rather than on the highly speculative endeavor of integrating the dignity of intelligent machines into our existing ethical framework. Thank you very much for listening to me. And apologies for going slightly over time there, Mathias and Shushma.
Thank you so much, John. That was fascinating. And for those of you in our audience who are on Twitter, I highly recommend following John. I get my daily dose of inspiration and very thought-provoking commentary on the state of the world. So, John, I'm thinking of something that ties together something you said at the beginning and something that you said towards the end, which is about this being in the domain of ordinary thought, right? And you talked towards the end about the values of participation, public participation. And I'm wondering how you reconcile this with the fact that many people are simply not aware of the role that artificial intelligence is playing in the way it's transforming our lives, our preferences, our choices, perhaps even our future behaviors. The workplaces, et cetera, the surveillance that occurs. And many of the entities that focus on the ethics of AI are located at, elite universities, think tanks, perhaps even funded by these very large tech firms or CEOs that have profited from these enterprises. So how do you think these concepts can be discussed, debated, and really shaped by people whose lives are affected by this, and not just in the US and UK, where we happen to be, but really around the world, where increasingly governments and companies are using AIs to track everyone's movements and to shape their actions and activities?
I think you're raising an incredibly important question there, because, of course, when I talk about participation, the kind of participation I want to have is informed participation. It's not simply a matter of people participating by expressing prejudices, but rather engaging in a form of deliberation that is informed and also is willing to hear other people and give reasons for beliefs. So that's really important. I think I would say two things about the really important challenge that you're raising. The first is that we shouldn't underestimate what people know or what insights they have. So, for example, the Aristotelian adage that sometimes the person who lives in the house knows more about it than the architect who designed it. I think we need to think about one example that I could give you is a psychologist working in London with criminal offenders. And she reports back that these offenders would prefer to be sentenced by a human judge than by an AI tool, even if they're aware that a human judge is more susceptible to bias and to error than the AI tool. And she says they want the human touch. And her own view about that was, this is deeply misguided. She says, if it were me, I would automatically opt for the AI tool if I were assured that it was more accurate in terms of applying the law. I think it's real food for thought to ask yourself why the offenders went the other way. Now, of course, there could be a cynical interpretation. They might be gamblers who imagine that the bias might go in their favor, right? But I think there's also a non-cynical interpretation, which is those people that are at the sharp end of the criminal justice system may be aware of certain kinds of values that are threatened by artificial intelligence that those who never really have to experience going through the criminal justice system simply aren't aware of. So the first thing I'd say is, let's not underestimate the kind of knowledge and insight people can have because of their diverse experiences. And this is kind of million point that it's one thing to speculate idly in a philosophical discussion where there is no decision point at the end of it. But for people who are actually impacted, they have a certain kind of knowledge based on that experience that I think could be incredibly valuable. One of the things I really want to do in the Institute is try to bring in those broader voices and find formats that enables that to happen so that we reach outside of a purely academic discussion. So that's my first point. Don't underestimate the knowledge. But the second point is, I think we face a tremendous issue about being very serious about democracy, and being very serious about democracy means ensuring people have the wherewithal to engage in an informed way, ensuring people have the requisite forms of education. So I guess I would say, to that extent, we have a project that we have to undertake, which is taking very seriously various socioeconomic rights, including the right to education, which if they're not secured, then democracy becomes pretty much a hollow concept.
Thank you, John, from my side as well. Let me follow up with not altogether different question, namely about engaging the role of the philosopher, the role of the ethics specialist in particular in this discourse. So I've noticed that in the engineering community, there is a certain kind of skepticism towards the professional expertise of the philosopher, especially the ethicist. And it often goes somewhere like this. So they are saying we are building technology for the future. We are building machines, programs, and they need to build in certain kind of value judgments. But we really want to be neutral, or we want to be open-ended. We want to be inclusive, especially of marginalized voices, especially people who have a bit of a global perspective. There say we need to really have a broadly ranging sourcing activities here. And as we bring in the so-called experts on these matters, we are automatically narrowing the focus, and we are re-empowering those who are representing dominant traditions. So there is a strong set of voices in the engineering and the computer science community skeptical of the involvement of people like you and I, basically. How do you deal with that? It's of course also very much a question about, in a way, how does the institute that you have in the process of founding or just founded, how does that relate to this kind of skepticism?
That's a really good question. So I take, there's a whole question about to what extent, for example, moral philosophers are experts, and in what precise sense they are experts in this domain, right? So I don't take that as something that's obviously given, that there is an expertise that means that if you have a PhD in moral philosophy, therefore you're more likely than other people to make correct moral judgments. I think that's false. So then the question is, well, what is the role of the moral philosopher? And what I would say the role of the moral philosopher is that the philosopher has something to contribute to the debate, the ultimately democratic debate that has to take place about the principles that will govern the use and development of these technologies. So what is it that I have to contribute? Well, for example, one of the things that you can contribute is when people adopt a certain view of ethics as unproblematically given, as seems to be the case with preference utilitarianism, you can point out the standard problems with these views and the existence of alternative models. That's an important contribution. You can also draw out various distinctions between something being a matter of obligation versus something being simply a matter of a reason. So the point that I'm making is, it's not so much that these people have some kind of special access to the moral truth, but rather that they have a series of understandings about the conceptual layout of this area and the history of this area that, if brought into public debate in an accessible way and fed into that debate, I think can help enhance that debate. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, I think that one of the things that we struggle with in a democratic system is skepticism that these sorts of issues can be resolved rationally. That really what's at stake, you might think, go back to Crawford, is ultimately a power struggle. Some people have certain values, others have different values. It's basically a power struggle. Democracy itself can be seen as simply a way of containing that power struggle. I think that view of democracy is deeply dangerous, and also that view of addressing ethical questions, that it's simply a power struggle between contending ideologies. So one of the other things that I think we can do, apart from making actual contributions to specific subject areas by drawing on certain distinctions and so forth, another thing we can do, I think we have a heavy responsibility, is to try to model for the rest of the society what it is to engage in a civil and rational dialogue about these matters in a way that they're not assimilated to a power struggle, but there are better and worse reasons for positions. And I think we're in a privileged position to do this, partly in virtue of our powerlessness, right? Precisely because we don't get to decide things. There is a greater, we're insulated from certain pressures that means that perhaps we can model this kind of discourse for the wider community. So those are the two things that I would say. There is within our intellectual repertoire something that we can contribute to an ongoing dialogue. And then more generally, as academics engaged in this discussion, we can model civil and rational debate, that there are rationally better or worse positions. It's not simply, can I get the numbers against someone who's got a different view from me?
So I'm going to build on the question that Mathias asked with a question from our audience that I'm paraphrasing a bit. And they're wondering whether the focus on STEM training to the neglect of humanities, other disciplines, is that going to affect us in the future as we think about AI and ethics?
It may affect us in the future, but I've got to tell you one thing, the thing that has made me most encouraged in coming to Oxford and taking up this job, and that is encountering young people in STEM who take ethics really seriously, right? They seem to have thought really hard and seriously about ethical matters relating to the area of science that they're involved in, and more broadly. And more importantly, they don't seem to think of this as some kind of extraneous activity to what they're really meant to be focusing on. I think this is incredibly encouraging. And I think we need to get beyond the idea that either you're doing STEM or you're doing humanities. And here I'm going to shamelessly plug Oxford. Oxford is unique in Britain, I think, that you cannot do philosophy. Usually you can do a degree in history or in law. You cannot do philosophy on its own in Oxford, right? You have to do it in combination with something else: politics and economics, classics, mathematics, physics. And I think what we really need is not this kind of dichotomous struggle between humanities and STEM subjects, but just the profound recognition that many of the most serious problems that confront us now do not respect these disciplinary boundaries, and that we have to inject this humanistic understanding all over the curriculum and not confine it merely to the humanities.
John, let me give you one question from the audience, and then I will add one of my own, but these are going to be very different questions. The question from the audience is from Rachel Saunders, and Rachel is wondering the following: is there also a need to account for who is developing AI, as Chinese, Israeli, and US AIs will have very different social and cultural imprints on them? And that's Rachel's question. Let me add one of my own, again, somewhat different question, very different question. So as I'm thinking about also the connection between the STEM subjects and the humanities, one thing that I tend to think about in the reinstantiated role of the humanities is, and then also in the spirit of a humanistic ethics, is to think of the humanities as redirecting somewhat the students who are taking classes in them to deal with one particular human, namely themselves, a bit more. the idea is something, the idea is, easily illustrated with regard to surveillance capitalism that, our faculty associate here at the Carr Center, Shoshana Zuboff, has been talking quite a bit about that. We are increasingly living lives that are becoming fully commodified, right, by exhuming these data that are collected for commercial purposes, and we are thereby ourselves becoming just like one big constellation of data points in a bigger scheme. Yeah? And one way of resisting just being sucked into this big machinery is to also refocus on ourselves, the development of our own personality, character. Of course, the original Greek meaning of ethics, right, is character. So would you agree that this is also a role where we can actually see a future for the humanities balancing, this data moloch by having disciplines that are also about self-interrogation, personality development, character formation?
Excellent. So these are great questions. Yes, Rachel, it does depend on who develops the AI and what values they have. So I've been plugging the importance of pluralism in this paper. And I think it's perfectly correct to assume that there is not one privileged scheme that is going to be correct for regulating AI, and there may be legitimate variation from one culture to another. So there is no question about that. It just follows from the pluralism that we've been talking about. But on the other hand, there are also profound reasons why you need to have some global standards as well. And this is another one of my interests, which is philosophy of international law. I think what we need to think really hard about is two things. Are there some basic standards that democracies can agree to in this area? So this would have to require abstracting away from some differences in order to reap the benefits of some kind of cross-democratic uniformity, because this would facilitate various kinds of valuable activities like data sharing in order to further health research and so forth. And then the second question, which is, can we then go even more minimal and try to identify standards that we can nonetheless uphold that apply globally, even in the case of non-democratic societies like China? And I think these are really quite profoundly important questions, how you can reach these more minimal standards in a way that isn't deeply ethically compromising. And we have a great problem in dealing with this issue, however, and that is the tendency of international law to have become a repository of really utopian ideals. And that's partly because if you have a system of law that is largely not enforced, then of course it can become the focus of all sorts of utopian ideals because you never really have the question of implementing them. But if we want to really implement the law, then we have to also think more realistically about where we can actually achieve a kind of honorable compromise on shared values. I think this geopolitical aspect of AI governance is going to be increasingly important and will test issues about the limits to which we can tolerate diversity, the limits of pluralism. On the point that you're making, Matthias, it sounds quite profound to me, but I'm inclined to agree that the reason I began by talking about two questions of ethics, one was about the nature of individual flourishing or well-being, and the other about morality, was because I think these two things are profoundly connected. Right? If I had a kind of Kantian approach, I would say they're two entirely different topics, or the utilitarian approach that countenances the possibility, radical discontinuity between what it is to be a morally good person and what it is to live a fulfilling life. But one of the things that I would account as being part of a truly attractive humanistic ethic is to capture the Platonic Aristotelian ideal that, in a sense, there is a harmony between personal self-fulfillment and doing right by others. So I entirely agree that part of what we're trying to do here when we talk about AI ethics, it's not simply about constraining myself in order to properly respect the rights of others. We're also speaking more deeply about the question, what it is to be someone that can live a truly satisfying, fulfilling life in contemporary circumstances. And you're absolutely right. Datification, surveillance capitalism militate in powerful ways against that.
John, this has been a fascinating presentation and conversation. I'm wondering whether prior to wrapping up, if you could just share briefly for our audience, what are your big plans for your institute?
I try to avoid having Stalinist 5-year plans. It seems kind of incompatible with my love for human rights and democracy. But insofar as I do have a plan, there are two things happening at the moment. We are still in the process of trying to recruit very high quality people as we expand our numbers. So that is a very important priority. I also am keen to try to develop the notion of democracy as a kind of overarching theme under which many other issues can be addressed, because whatever those issues are, AI and climate change, AI and the legal system, there is a kind of meta theme under which they operate, which is that we need a form of democratic decision making to resolve them, not platonic guardians, philosophers, what have you. And then there are two other things I really want to emphasize, and that is I want to have a truly humanistic approach to ethics, and that means philosophy reaching out to other humanities disciplines, but also to the arts. And I'm trying to find ways in order to integrate those disciplines into the discussion. And the last point is, I really, and the pandemic has been problematic in this regard, I want to find formats in which we can have the input of normal citizens into this discussion. Because of the point I made before, I really do believe it. People at the sharp end of various forms of technology often have very little voice, but they do have a kind of knowledge that we may lack.
Thank you so much, John, for joining us today and for your work.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, guys.